We don't often talk about the law as revealed in the Old Testament, and yet the law of God was given within the context of the overall story of God's work in the world, starting with Genesis and continuing on somewhere into the future. The story does not begin or end with the law. The law is just a part, but it's an important part. The story in which the law appears begins with creation, with a God of power and care and personality who pulls order from chaos, who pulls light from darkness, who pulls mankind from dust, who created a world and called it good. Part of the goodness was seen in the order and the boundaries. The sea had its place, for example. There was a difference between the animal and plant kingdom. There was another division between people and the rest of creation. God even placed Adam and Eve in a garden of paradise, but even that garden had boundaries. The goodness became corrupted, however, and the father and mother of humanity learned quickly what we all learn at some point in our lives. Like everything else in God's creation, we need boundaries, or we will destroy all that is good around us. We're a stubborn people, though, so we get the lesson again and again. Jump ahead in the story of God to the exodus of God's chosen people from the land of bondage in Egypt. It's almost another creation event. It's the creation of a new nation from a land of bondage and spiritual darkness and moral chaos. And once again, God gives boundaries. The story is not taking a new path. The Old Testament law is given at Mount Sinai were an integral part of the ongoing revelation of God who specializes in taking things that seem chaotic and frightening and oppressive and making something new. And that new thing always involves boundaries. It has to. So we see in Exodus the echoing of the similar storyline begun in Genesis. Order from chaos, light from darkness, a good thing from a bad thing. A story that has continued throughout history, from the biggest of world events to the smallest of individual lives. God does this over and over and over again. And so he rescued them, and at Mount Sinai he offered them a covenant. Exodus 24:7 specifically says that the law was the book of the covenant. It follows a pattern of ancient Near East covenants, so it was in an easily recognizable form of the time. In addition, the Hebrews would have recognized this as what's called a ketubah, a legal document agreed upon and signed by both parties in a marriage. It was a comprehensive summary of the expectations of this new covenant relationship, explaining the kinds of behavior that were consistent with covenant membership. The bride and the groom, well, in this case, God and God's people, were to be clear about what they were agreeing to enter into and what it would take for this relationship to work. Some translations will phrase this God-given ketubah, the Ten Commandments, as you will not recognize any other gods. You will not take the name of the Lord in vain. You will not kill. It's future tense. God seems to be saying, if you want a covenant with me, this is what the covenant will look like. So this is God, the groom, saying, do you, Israel, take me to have and to hold from this day on, for better, for worse, for rich, for poor, in sickness and health. And Israel responds, we do. So this law, this ketubah, was not given as a means of salvation, but it's a gift from a gracious God to allow people to know him better and to know what it means to walk in his ways. The Hebrew people embraced this revelation. It put righteous living directly within reach of the most ordinary of people. What God expected was not revealed just to mystics or sages or God kings. No, Deuteronomy 30:11-14 says, the word is very near you. It's in your mouth and in your heart so that you may obey it. David places the law alongside creation as one of the greatest declarations of God. Read Psalm 19. After praising creation, he moves directly into this. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. They are more precious than gold, and they are sweeter than honey. This went far beyond personal ethics. The Israelites were called to live this way because they were meant to show the character of God to the rest of the world. Deuteronomy 4:5-8 reads as follows. See, I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to take possession of it. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations who will hear about all these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them the way the Lord our God is near us whenever we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I am setting before you today? God's revelation of himself and his way is always meant to benefit the world, not just the individuals who love and follow him. Had the Israelites sung the lyrics, Lord, you are good and your mercy endures forever, they would have understood that also meant, and now I must show his goodness to others. So because God was compassionate, you were to show compassion. Because God felt your pain, you were to help others through their pain. Because God loved you, you were to love your spouse or your kids or your neighbors. Right and godly living was never reduced merely to what one person's life would look like. It was always understood in the context of community and the world. How will my godly or ungodly decisions affect the world and the people around me? Time after time, the Old Testament showed that if the people forgot God and went after other gods, their society would be characterized by injustice and oppression and cruelty and excess. It worked the other way, too. If a society was characterized by injustice and oppression, it was clear that the people were following other gods. So the principle is one that transcends times and cultures. If you choose the wrong God, you get the wrong society. Think of it this way. If people worship gods that are constantly at war with each other, is it any surprise that the people are constantly at war? If people worship gods who are promiscuous, is it any surprise that those who worship them started fertility cults? See, the God you choose will be reflected in the culture because people's priorities always reflect the priorities of their gods. In many of the cultures surrounding the Hebrews, possessions were of more worth than human life. One's life, especially if you were poor, was forfeit for theft or property damage. If people wanted a good crop, they killed other people. Gods of corn and stone require the elevation of corn and stone, not the people around the corn and the stone. But not in Israel. Possessions never meant more than life, because one of these things was created in the image of God, and it wasn't things, it wasn't property. So theft required restitution, not death. Bad crops were never a cause to kill people. If you choose the wrong God, you get the wrong set of cultural priorities. Let's move ahead a couple of centuries. The French Revolution was a decidedly atheistic, humanistic attempt to change the world. Voltaire, who was one of the fathers of the movement, had a statue of Diana, the goddess of reason, in his home. The results of the French Revolution were disastrous. When Madame Roland was brought to the guillotine in 1792 on false charges, she bowed mockingly toward the Statue of Liberty and said, "Liberty, what crimes are committed in your name?" So if you choose the wrong God, you destroy liberty and freedom. Fast forward again. Hitler, ironically, referred to the law given to the Jewish nation as the life-denying 10 Commandments. In the process of trying to eradicate the chosen people of what he called a tyrannical God, whose commands robbed people of life, he experimented on and slaughtered millions of people he considered subhuman. If you choose the wrong God, you get a false view of human life. One more. Alfred Kinsey, who has set the tone of sexual discussion in the 1950s, did not believe in God, and he viewed humans not as people who bore God's image, but as little more than animals. When he researched human sexuality, he expected to find that people behave like animals, and, surprise, he did find that. Perhaps that's why the closing credits in the 2004 film Kinsey, a film meant to celebrate the man who liberated us from all the old-fashioned Judeo-Christian prudishness about sex, showed nature films of animals copulating in the background. If you choose the wrong God, you get the false view of sexuality. How we feel about God has implications far beyond living a personally ethical life and feeling good about our decisions. Ethical living has a ripple effect. Nothing exists in a vacuum, especially our moral choices. Perhaps that's why there's an order to the commands. The first are about God, the last are about people. If you begin with a correct view of God, what follows is a correct view of mankind. It's the same order Jesus gave. First, love the Lord your God, and then love your neighbors. As Lauren Winner notes in her book, Real Sex, the Mosaic Law does protective work, pointing to, guarding, and returning God's people to the created order, the world as God meant it to be. To see the biblical witness as an attempt to direct us to the created order is to recognize the true goodness of God's creation. The law cares for us and protects us, written by a lawgiver who understands that life outside of God's created intent destroys us. By contrast, life lived inside the contours of God's law harmonizes us and makes us beautiful. It makes us creatures living well in the created order. It gives us the opportunity to become who we are meant to be.